Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the past in soothing detail to help you drift into peaceful rest. Tonight, we journey to Southeast Asia, a region of monsoon rains, mighty rivers, and ancient civilizations that rose and fell like the tides. Imagine, if you will, a landscape where water dominates existence. During the summer monsoon, clouds roll in from the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, bringing torrential rains that transform rivers into roaring torrents and turn rice paddies into mirrors reflecting the sky. Then come the dry months, when the water recedes, leaving behind nutrient-rich silt, and farmers plant their crops in the warm, humid earth. This rhythm of wet and dry, flood and drought has shaped human civilization in Southeast Asia for millennia. We'll explore three remarkable empires that mastered this environment: the Khmer, builders of Angkor Wat; the Pagan, who created a golden age in Burma; and the Dai Viet, guardians of Vietnamese independence. Let the gentle rhythm of history wash over you as we travel back through the centuries. If you enjoy tonight's story, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you may think. Our story begins in the fertile lowlands of mainland Southeast Asia, where great rivers like the Mekong, Irrawaddy, and Red River have nourished civilizations for millennia. These are not ordinary rivers, but vast, life-giving arteries that connect mountains to sea, highlands to lowlands, people to people. The Mekong, one of the world's longest rivers, begins its journey in the snow-capped peaks of the Tibetan Plateau, over 5,000 meters above sea level. It descends through deep gorges in Yunnan, flows through the Golden Triangle where Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar meet, then broadens as it enters the plains of Cambodia and Vietnam, finally spreading into a vast delta before emptying into the South China Sea. Along this journey of nearly 5,000 kilometers, the Mekong picks up sediment, nutrients, and tributaries, becoming muddy and brown, rich with the minerals that will fertilize the rice paddies of millions of farmers. The Irrawaddy follows a similar pattern in Burma, while the Red River performs the same function in Vietnam. These waterways brought life-giving sediment from distant mountains, creating rich agricultural lands that could support dense populations. It was along these rivers and their tributaries that three great empires would emerge, each leaving an indelible mark on the region's history and culture. The rivers also connected these civilizations to the wider world, serving as highways for trade goods, diplomatic missions, and armies. A boat floating down the Mekong might carry Khmer rice to trade for Chinese ceramics, or transport a Buddhist monk on pilgrimage to study sutras in a distant monastery. Part 1. The Khmer Empire. The Khmer Empire, one of the most powerful states in Southeast Asian history, dominated much of mainland Southeast Asia for over 600 years. At its height in the 12th and 13th centuries, the empire controlled territories that today include Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and southern Vietnam. But to understand this magnificent civilization, we must travel back to its origins in the early 9th century. Before the Khmer Empire emerged, the region was home to various smaller kingdoms and polities. The most significant predecessor was the Kingdom of Chenla, which itself had grown from the earlier state of Funan. These pre-Angkorian kingdoms had already established sophisticated water management systems and absorbed influences from Indian civilization, including Hinduism and Buddhism, Sanskrit writing, and concepts of divine kingship. The true foundation of the Khmer Empire came in the year 802, when a king named Jayavarman II proclaimed himself Chakravartin, or universal ruler. This wasn't merely a political declaration, but a religious transformation. Jayavarman II established the cult of the Devaraja, or God King, which would define Khmer kingship for centuries to come. In this conception, the king was not simply chosen by the gods, but was himself a manifestation of divine power on earth, specifically associated with the Hindu god Shiva. Jayavarman II had spent time at the court of the Sailendra dynasty in Java before returning to Cambodia. The influence of Javanese court culture was evident in his adoption of mountain symbolism. He established his capital at various locations before finally settling on the region around Angkor. The choice was strategic, positioned near the Tonle Sap Lake, Southeast Asia's largest freshwater lake, which provided abundant fish and facilitated an elaborate irrigation system. The Tonle Sap itself is a hydrological wonder unlike any other body of water on Earth. During the dry season, from November to May, the lake covers an area of approximately 2,500 square kilometers, with an average depth of only 1 meter. It's a shallow, murky expanse of water teeming with fish. But when the monsoon rains arrive in June, everything changes. The Mekong River, swollen with water from across its vast watershed, begins to rise. By July, the Mekong's water level has increased so much that it reverses the flow of the Tonle Sap River, which normally drains the lake into the Mekong. Instead, water flows backward from the Mekong into the lake. Over the next 4 months, the Tonle Sap expands to cover over 15,000 square kilometers, increasing in size by 6 times and in volume by 60 times. The water depth increases to 9 meters or more in places. This annual flood deposits nutrient-rich sediment across the floodplains, creating ideal conditions for rice cultivation and supporting massive fish populations that migrate between river and lake. The fish come to spawn in the flooded forests around the lake's edge, where the water is rich with insects and plant matter. When the water recedes in October and November, the fish are trapped in pools and channels, making them easy to catch in vast quantities. This annual rhythm provided the Khmer people with an incredibly productive environment that could support large populations without the need for intensive irrigation. The Khmer civilization was built on managing and maximizing this natural rhythm, constructing reservoirs to store water for use in the dry season and channels to distribute water where it was needed. Following Jayavarman II's death, around 835, his successors continued to consolidate power and expand the realm. King Indravarman I, who ruled from 877 to 889, made crucial innovations in hydraulic engineering. He constructed the Indratataka, a massive reservoir or barrage, and built the temple of Preah Ko. These projects established a pattern that would define Khmer kingship. Each monarch would construct their own temple mountain and contribute to the kingdom's water management infrastructure. Indravarman's son, Yasovarman I, who reigned from 889 to around 910, founded the first city at Angkor proper. He built the great Yashodharataka Reservoir, measuring approximately 7 kilometers by 1.8 kilometers. At the center of his capital, he constructed the Temple Mountain of Phnom Bakheng on a natural hill. This temple, with its 108 towers representing the peaks of Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain of Hindu-Buddhist cosmology, became the spiritual center of the empire. The concept of the Temple Mountain was central to Khmer architecture and theology. Each temple represented Mount Meru, the center of the universe according to Hindu-Buddhist cosmology. The concentric galleries represented the mountain ranges surrounding Meru, while the moat symbolized the cosmic ocean. By constructing these elaborate stone representations of the cosmos, Khmer kings asserted their role as the link between the earthly and divine realms. The 10th century saw continued expansion and occasional upheaval. Kings like Rajendravarman II and Jayavarman V maintained the tradition of temple construction, building Pre-Rup and Tar-Keo respectively. These temples showed increasingly sophisticated architectural techniques, with more refined carving and engineering. The Khmer had developed exceptional skill in sandstone construction, quarrying blocks from the Kulen Mountains and transporting them to Angkor, likely using elephants and water routes. The early 11th century brought a period of turmoil. King Suryavarman I, who ruled from approximately 1006 to 1050, seized the throne through military force rather than legitimate succession. Despite this controversial beginning, his reign marked an important period of expansion. He extended Khmer control westward into what is now Thailand, incorporating the Mon kingdoms of the Chao Phraya Valley. He also pushed south into the Malay Peninsula, establishing Khmer influence over important trade routes. Suryavarman I's territorial expansion brought new sources of wealth and labour to the empire. The Khmer state relied heavily on a complex system of corvée labour, where subjects owed service to the king for construction projects and military campaigns. The great temples were built not by slaves, but by this obligatory labour, supplemented by artisans and craftsmen. Inscriptions tell us that thousands of workers would be mobilized for major projects, coordinated by a sophisticated administrative hierarchy. The mid-11th century saw the reign of Udayadityavarman II from 1050 to 1066. He constructed the Baphwan Temple, a massive pyramid temple that originally stood around 50 meters high. Contemporary Chinese accounts describe it as a tower of bronze, suggesting that its central tower may have been covered in bronze plates that gleamed in the tropical sun. The Baphwan represented the pinnacle of the pyramid temple style before Angkor Wat would redefine Khmer architecture. Then came Suryavarman II, who ruled from approximately 1113 to 1150. This king would leave the most enduring legacy in stone, Angkor Wat. Built as his state temple and eventual mausoleum, Angkor Wat is the largest religious monument ever constructed. The temple complex covers over 400 acres, with the main temple structure rising 65 meters high. Its construction required an estimated 300,000 workers and 6,000 elephants, labouring for approximately 30 years. Unlike earlier Khmer temples, which were dedicated to Shiva, Angkor Wat was dedicated to Vishnu. This shift reflected changes in religious emphasis during Suryavarman II's reign. The temple's orientation toward the west, unusual for Khmer temples, has led scholars to suggest it was always intended as a funerary temple. The vast bas-reliefs covering the gallery walls depict scenes from Hindu mythology, particularly the Ramayana and Mahabharata, as well as historical processions showing the king and his army. The artistic achievement of Angkor Wat extends beyond its architecture to the extraordinary skill of the stone carvers who decorated its surfaces. Over 1,800 square meters of bas-relief carving cover the gallery walls, depicting scenes of incredible complexity and beauty. The carvers worked from detailed sketches or templates, but the execution required years of training and exceptional skill. They used simple iron chisels and hammers to carve the hard grey sandstone, working from scaffolding erected against the gallery walls. The precision is remarkable. The depth of carving is consistent across vast surfaces, and the perspective and proportions are carefully maintained throughout long narrative sequences. The sculptors who created Angkor Wat's masterpieces were part of a long tradition of Khmer art that had developed over centuries. Earlier temples show the evolution of style from the somewhat stiff, formal figures of the 9th and 10th centuries to the more naturalistic and dynamic compositions of the classical period in the late 11th and 12th centuries. Khmer artists achieved a distinctive aesthetic that balanced Indian influences with indigenous sensibilities. The deities and celestial beings they depicted wear elaborate jewelry and costumes that reflect actual Khmer royal regalia, creating a fusion of divine and earthly splendor. Particularly noteworthy are the apsaras, celestial dancing maidens that decorate the walls of Angkor Wat and other temples. Over 3,000 individual apsara carvings grace Angkor Wat alone, each one unique in her pose, jewelry, and headdress. These graceful figures, with their elaborate hairstyles, long skirts, and bare torsos adorned with jewelry, represent the ideal of feminine beauty in Khmer culture. They also serve a religious function, as celestial beings who dance for the gods and mediate between the human and divine realms. The care lavished on these decorative elements shows that Angkor Wat was not merely a political monument, but a complete artistic and religious statement. The bas-reliefs at Angkor Wat are masterpieces of narrative sculpture. The southern gallery features a famous depiction of the churning of the ocean of milk, a Hindu creation myth in which gods and demons work together to extract the elixir of immortality. The detail is extraordinary. You can count individual fingers on the hundreds of figures, each demon and deity rendered with distinctive features and expressions. Other galleries show the king in procession, mounted on an elephant beneath parasols that denote his rank, surrounded by his army marching in precise formation. Jayavarman II also extended the empire's reach. He launched campaigns against the Champa kingdom in what is now central Vietnam, seeking to control the lucrative maritime trade routes along the coast. He sent diplomatic missions to China, establishing formal tributary relations with the Song dynasty. These missions brought prestige and facilitated trade, with Chinese ceramics becoming increasingly common in elite Khmer contexts. The economy of the Khmer Empire was remarkably sophisticated for its time, based on a combination of intensive rice agriculture, specialized crafts, and long-distance trade. The primary wealth came from rice production in the areas around the Tonle Sap and throughout the empire's territories. The Khmer developed an intricate system of irrigation that maximized rice yields with networks of canals, reservoirs, and dikes that controlled water flow and allowed multiple harvests per year in some areas. This agricultural surplus supported a large non-farming population, artisans, merchants, soldiers, officials, and religious specialists. Trade goods flowed through Angkor from across mainland and maritime Southeast Asia. From the north came Chinese silks, ceramics, and metal goods, brought overland through trade networks or shipped down the coast and up the Mekong. From the west came Indian textiles, precious stones, and luxury goods. The Khmer exported rice, dried fish, forest products like aromatic woods and resins, and manufactured goods including textiles and metalwork. Archaeological excavations at Angkor have uncovered Chinese ceramics from multiple dynasties, glass beads from India and the Middle East, and bronze goods from various Southeast Asian sources, demonstrating the empire's integration into regional and long-distance trade networks. The Khmer state maintained control over this economy through a complex administrative system. Royal officials supervised irrigation works, collected taxes in the form of rice and labour service, regulated markets, and organised corvée labour for temple construction and public works. Land was owned in various ways. Some was royal domain farmed by labourers owing service to the king. Some was granted to temples and monasteries as endowments. Some was given to nobles and officials as rewards for service, and some was held by individual families through customary rights. This created a patchwork of overlapping claims and obligations that required constant negotiation and management. Craft specialists in Angkor produced a wide range of goods. Bronze workers created tools, weapons, and ritual objects using lost wax casting techniques. Potters made both utilitarian wares for daily use and fine ceramics for the elite. Weavers produced cotton and silk textiles, some plain and serviceable, others elaborately patterned and dyed for ceremonial use. Stone carvers created the countless sculptures and reliefs that decorated the temples. Gold and silversmiths crafted jewellery and decorative objects for the court and temples. Each of these crafts required years of apprenticeship to master, and the knowledge was often passed down within families from generation to generation. Following Jayavarman II's death around 1150, the empire entered a period of instability. The succession was disputed, and the Champa, whom Jayavarman had repeatedly attacked, saw an opportunity for revenge. In 1177, Cham forces launched a naval attack up the Mekong River and the Tonle Sap, sacking the Khmer capital. It was a devastating blow, unprecedented in Khmer history. The royal palace was burned, and the Cham occupiers held Angkor for 4 years. From this chaos emerged one of the greatest Khmer kings, Jayavarman VII. Initially serving as a military commander, he drove the Cham forces from Khmer territory and reclaimed the capital. He ascended the throne around 1181, already in his 50s, and would rule until approximately 1218. His long reign would transform the empire religiously, architecturally, and territorially. Jayavarman VII was a devout Buddhist, specifically a follower of Mahayana Buddhism. While earlier kings had been Hindu or occasionally Buddhist, none had embraced Buddhism with such fervour. He reimagined the concept of the Devaraja in Buddhist terms, seeing himself as a bodhisattva, an enlightened being who delays nirvana to help others achieve enlightenment. This religious transformation manifested in an unprecedented building program. Jayavarman VII constructed more monuments than all previous Khmer kings combined. His greatest achievement was the city of Angkor Thom, a vast urban complex covering 9 square kilometers, surrounded by walls and a moat. At its center stood the Bayon temple, a unique architectural creation featuring 54 towers, each carved with 4 faces of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, bearing a serene smile that has become iconic. These 216 faces gazed in all directions, symbolizing the omnipresent compassion of the Buddha and the watchfulness of the king. The Bayon's bas-reliefs depict both mythological scenes and remarkably detailed images of daily life in the Khmer Empire. We see market scenes with vendors selling fish, cockfights and gambling, childbirth and food preparation, Chinese traders in distinctive hats, and even a naval battle with the Cham, where soldiers and rowers strain at their oars. These carvings provide an invaluable historical record of ordinary life in a civilization that left few written accounts of everyday existence. Jayavarman VII also constructed 102 hospitals throughout his realm, marking them with inscriptions detailing their purpose and the medicines to be dispensed. He built rest houses along the empire's roads every 15 kilometers, providing shelter for travelers and pilgrims. These works of public merit reflected his Buddhist conception of kingship as compassionate service. The scale of his building program was so vast that some scholars believe it may have overtaxed the empire's resources, contributing to later decline. 2 of Jayavarman VII's most beautiful creations were Tar Prom and Preah Khan, temples dedicated to his mother and father respectively, in the syncretic style that identified them with Buddhist deities. Tar Prom has been left partly unrestored, with massive silk cotton trees growing through and over the galleries, their roots cascading over carved sandstone in a dramatic fusion of nature and architecture. The temple's inscriptions tell us it housed over 12,000 people, including 3,000 priests and 600 dancers. The Khmer Empire under Jayavarman VII reached its maximum territorial extent, controlling much of modern Thailand, Laos, and parts of Burma and Malaysia. But this expansion came at a cost. The continuous military campaigns, massive construction projects, and elaborate bureaucracy required enormous resources. The population was heavily taxed and subjected to corvée labour on an unprecedented scale. Some regions began to chafe under Khmer domination, particularly the Thai peoples who were settling in increasing numbers in the empire's western territories. After Jayavarman VII's death around 1218, the empire entered a long, gradual decline. His immediate successors struggled to maintain the vast realm he had assembled. There was also a Hindu revivalist reaction against his Buddhist transformation of the state. Many of Jayavarman VII's Buddhist images were vandalized or recarved as Hindu deities, and some temples were rededicated to Hindu gods. This religious conflict may have weakened the ideological foundations of royal authority. The 13th century saw the rise of new powers that would challenge Khmer supremacy. The Thai kingdoms of Sukhothai and later Ayutthaya grew in strength, gradually absorbing former Khmer territories. These Thai polities were more decentralized and flexible than the highly centralized Khmer state, allowing them to adapt more quickly to changing conditions. The Mon peoples of the West also began to reassert their independence. During the 13th century, the Khmer Empire also faced a transformation in its religious landscape. Theravada Buddhism, arriving from Sri Lanka and spreading through the Mon kingdoms, began to replace both Hinduism and Mahayana Buddhism among the Khmer population. Unlike the royal cults that had dominated earlier, Theravada Buddhism emphasized individual merit-making and monastic communities supported by lay donations. This shift undermined the religious justification for the massive state-sponsored temple construction that had characterized the Angkorian period. A Chinese diplomat named Zhou Daguan visited Angkor in 1296 to 1297, leaving us the most detailed contemporary account of the city at its height. He described a bustling metropolis with a population estimated between 700,000 and 1 million people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. The streets were crowded with merchants, the canals busy with boats, and the palace grounds magnificent beyond description. Yet Zhou also noted signs of strain, military campaigns against the Thai that were increasingly costly and less successful. Zhou's account provides fascinating details of daily life. He described the royal processions, where the king rode atop an elephant under golden parasols, preceded by cavalry and followed by palace women in carriages. He noted the prevalence of skin diseases, which he attributed to the climate and frequent bathing. He was amazed by the custom of temporary sexual abstinence after childbirth, which could last from 1 to 4 years depending on social rank. His descriptions of the wooden houses, raised on stilts and covered with tile or thatch, matched the dwellings depicted in the Bayon bas-reliefs. Zhou Daguan also described the markets of Angkor, which operated daily and attracted merchants from across the empire and beyond. Women dominated retail trade, sitting in the market stalls selling rice, fish, vegetables, betel nuts, textiles, and various manufactured goods. The currency was a mixture of barter and small change made of rice or cloth, as the Khmer did not mint coins. Chinese merchants brought ceramics, lacquerware, and metal goods, trading them for local products like dried fish, rhinoceros horn, kingfisher feathers, and forest products like benzo and lac. The markets were supervised by royal officials who collected taxes and resolved disputes. Daily life in Angkor revolved around rice cultivation and the Buddhist calendar. Most people were farmers who worked in the rice paddies during the planting and harvest seasons, maintaining the irrigation channels and dikes and caring for water buffalo. The working day began before dawn to avoid the heat of midday. Men and women worked together in the fields, planting rice seedlings in neat rows in the flooded paddies. Children helped by chasing birds away from ripening grain or carrying water and food to workers. During the dry season, when agricultural work was lighter, farmers might be called for corvée labour on temple construction or public works projects, or they might engage in fishing, crafts, or trade to supplement their income. The Buddhist calendar marked the rhythm of religious observance. Every new moon and full moon was a holy day when people would visit temples, make offerings to monks, and listen to Dharma talks. The major festivals, particularly the New Year in April and the end of the rainy season retreat in October, were celebrated with elaborate ceremonies, offerings, and entertainment. The New Year festival involved ritual bathing of Buddha images, construction of sand, stupas, and games and performances. The autumn festival marked the end of the monastic retreat during the rainy season and was a time for robe offerings to monks and merit-making through donations and good deeds. Housing in Angkor reflected social status. The poorest lived in small bamboo huts with thatch roofs raised on low stilts to keep them dry during floods and allow air circulation. More prosperous families had larger wooden houses with tile roofs, multiple rooms, and verandas. The elite resided in compounds with several buildings, a main residence, separate kitchens, storehouses, and servant quarters, all within a fenced enclosure. Only temples and a few royal buildings were made of stone. Everything else was constructed from perishable materials like wood, bamboo, and thatch, which is why only the religious monuments have survived. The royal palace itself was built of wood, though parts of the platform and foundation remain. Zhou Dagwan described it as having golden towers and elaborate decoration, but all the wooden structures have long since rotted away. Food in Khmer society was primarily rice-based, supplemented with fish from the Tonle Sap, vegetables, and occasional meat. The daily diet for ordinary people consisted of rice, dried or fermented fish, vegetables, and spices. Wealthier individuals enjoyed more variety, including fresh fish, pork, chicken, duck, tropical fruits, and elaborate curries. The Khmer developed a distinctive cuisine that combined local ingredients with cooking techniques and spices from India. Fish sauce and fermented fish paste, still staples of Cambodian cooking today, were important condiments. Betel nut, chewed for its mild stimulant effects, was ubiquitous, and Zhou Dagwan noted that people's teeth were often stained black from the practice. The 14th century brought increasing pressure from the Thai kingdoms. In 1351, the Siamese kingdom of Ayutthaya captured Angkor for the first time, though the Khmer managed to retake it. This began a pattern of conflict that would continue for the next century. The Thai forces would capture Angkor, the Khmer would reclaim it, resources would be exhausted on both sides, and the cycle would repeat. Each campaign damaged Angkor's infrastructure and depleted its population. There were also environmental factors contributing to Angkor's decline. The elaborate water management system required constant maintenance. Silt build-up in the reservoirs and canals needed regular dredging. The system had been designed for a certain population level and agricultural intensity. As the demands on the system increased and maintenance became more difficult due to political instability and labour shortages, the hydraulic infrastructure began to fail. Some scholars argue that periods of drought or unusual rainfall patterns in the 14th and 15th centuries may have disrupted the agricultural base of the empire. The shift in trade patterns also affected Angkor's prosperity. Maritime trade was becoming increasingly important in Southeast Asia, with new routes connecting China, Southeast Asia, India, and eventually Europe. Angkor, located inland, was poorly positioned to benefit from this maritime commerce. The coastal areas, including those controlled by rivals like Ayutthaya and the Cham, had better access to the lucrative trade in spices, ceramics, and textiles. In 1431, Ayutthaya captured Angkor again, and this time the occupation was more permanent. The Khmer court abandoned the ancient capital, relocating to Phnom Penh, near the confluence of the Mekong and Tonle Sap rivers. This move reflected a strategic shift toward maritime trade and away from the agrarian hinterland that had sustained Angkor. The great city was not completely abandoned immediately, but it ceased to be the political centre of the kingdom. Angkor Wat itself was never truly abandoned. Buddhist monks maintained a presence there, and it gradually transformed into a Theravada Buddhist pilgrimage site. The Hindu deities were removed or reinterpreted as Buddhist figures, and Buddha images were installed throughout the complex. Local villagers continued to live in the area, farming the surrounding lands. But the grand vision of the city as the centre of a universal empire faded into memory. The post-Angkorian Khmer kingdom continued to exist, but it was a shadow of its former glory. Squeezed between the expanding Thai kingdoms to the west and Vietnamese expansion from the east, Cambodia struggled to maintain its independence. The kingdom moved its capital several times, never able to establish the stability that had characterized the Angkorian period. The Khmer kings became increasingly dependent on foreign powers, playing Thai and Vietnamese interests against each other to preserve their realm. Yet the legacy of the Khmer Empire endured. The Khmer language, art and culture continued to influence Southeast Asia. Thai, Lao and Burmese architecture all show Khmer influence. The concept of divine kingship, the integration of Buddhism and statecraft, and artistic styles all spread beyond the empire's political boundaries. Angkor Wat itself remained a powerful symbol of Khmer civilization, appearing on Cambodia's flag and currency. The temples slowly disappeared under the jungle. Trees grew through the galleries, their roots prying apart the carefully fitted stones. Sandstone blocks tumbled from towers as their supports rotted away. The forest reclaimed the city, hiding it from outsiders for centuries. Local knowledge of the ruins persisted, but to the wider world, Angkor became a legend, a lost city swallowed by the jungle. It was not until 1860 that Angkor was brought to European attention when French naturalist Henri Mouhot published accounts of his travels in Cambodia. His dramatic descriptions of vast ruins emerging from the jungle captured the imagination of the Western world. Though Mouhot himself never claimed to have discovered Angkor, which had never been lost to the Cambodian people, his writings sparked decades of archaeological and artistic interest in the Khmer Empire. The study of Angkor and the Khmer Empire has revealed a civilization of remarkable sophistication. The hydraulic engineering that supported the city was centuries ahead of its time. The artistic achievement of the temples represents one of humanity's great cultural flowerings. The political and religious synthesis that sustained the empire for 6 centuries demonstrates the adaptability and resilience of Khmer civilization. From its founding in the 9th century to its gradual eclipse in the 15th, the Khmer Empire shaped the history and culture of mainland Southeast Asia in ways that resonate to this day. Part 2. The Pagan Empire. As the Khmer Empire flourished in the lowlands of Cambodia, another great civilization arose to the west, in the central plains of Burma along the Irrawaddy River. This was the Kingdom of Pagan, sometimes called the Pagan Empire, which would dominate Burma and surrounding regions from the 9th to the 13th centuries, leaving a legacy of thousands of Buddhist temples that still dot the landscape. The region that would become the Pagan Empire had been inhabited for millennia. The Irrawaddy River Valley, like the other great river systems of Southeast Asia, provided fertile agricultural land and transportation routes. The earliest inhabitants included the Piu people, who had established city-states in the region as early as the 2nd century. These Piu cities were centers of Theravada Buddhism, trade, and sophisticated irrigation agriculture. The Piu city-states flourished for several centuries, developing writing systems, constructing impressive brick monuments, and engaging in long-distance trade with India and China. Chinese records from the Tang Dynasty describe Piu cities as wealthy and well-organized, with elaborate Buddhist monasteries and a literate population. However, in the 9th century, these cities declined, possibly due to attacks from the Nanzhao kingdom to the north, in what is now Yunnan province. Into this power vacuum came the Bamar people, a Tibeto-Burman ethnic group that had been migrating south from the Yunnan region for several centuries. The Bamar settled in the dry zone of central Burma, a region of low rainfall but great agricultural potential if properly irrigated. They established several settlements, but one would rise to prominence above all others: Pagan, founded on the eastern bank of the Irrawaddy River. Traditional Burmese chronicles date the founding of Pagan to 849, when a king named Painbia established it as his capital. Archaeological evidence suggests settlement in the area may have begun somewhat earlier, but Paimbia's reign marks the beginning of Pagan as a significant political centre. The location was strategic, positioned on the river for trade and transportation, surrounded by agricultural land that could be intensively farmed with proper irrigation, and distant enough from the coast to be secure from naval attacks. For its first 2 centuries, Pagan was a relatively modest city-state, one among several competing powers in Burma. The early kings engaged in the typical activities of Southeast Asian rulers, building temples, conducting raids on neighbours, and attempting to extend their control over nearby territories. The city grew gradually, absorbing refugees and incorporating surrounding villages, but it did not yet dominate the region. The transformation of Pagan from a local power to an empire began with the reign of Anarachta, who ruled from 1044 to 1077. Anarachta is remembered in Burmese history as one of the greatest kings, the founder of the first Burmese Empire, and the patron who brought Theravada Buddhism to prominence in Burma. His reign marked the true beginning of Pagan as a major power. When Anarachta came to power, Pagan practiced a form of Buddhism mixed with indigenous spirit worship and tantric Hindu practices. To the south, in the Mon kingdom of Thaton, a more orthodox form of Theravada Buddhism was practiced. According to tradition, Anarachta requested Buddhist scriptures from Manohar, the king of Thaton. When Manohar refused, Anarachta marched south, conquered Thaton in 1057, and carried back to Pagan not only the Tripitaka, the complete Buddhist canon, but also monks, artists, and craftsmen, along with King Manohar himself. This conquest had profound consequences for Burmese civilization. The Mon monks brought with them the Theravada Buddhist tradition in its purest form, along with sophisticated literary culture and architectural techniques. The Pali language, the liturgical language of Theravada Buddhism, became the language of religious scholarship in Pagan. Mon architectural styles influenced the construction of Buddhist monuments. The fusion of Bamar political power with Mon cultural refinement would characterize Pagan civilization for the next 2 centuries. Anarachta embarked on an ambitious temple-building program, constructing the Shwezigon Pagoda, which would become one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Burma. The Shwezigon enshrined what were believed to be relics of the Buddha, including a tooth and a portion of his frontal bone. The pagoda's design established a prototype that would be copied throughout Burma, a cylindrical base topped by a bell-shaped dome and crowned with a spire. Even today, the golden Shwezigon gleams in the sunlight, its surface covered in gold leaf applied by generations of devotees. Anarahta also expanded Pagan's political control. He campaigned against the Mons in the south, extending his authority to the coast. He sent expeditions east into the Shan Highlands, securing control over trade routes. To the north, he established a defensive frontier against potential threats from Nanzhao. By the end of his reign, Pagan controlled most of what is now Myanmar, from the borders of Yunnan in the north to the Tenasserim coast in the south. Anarahta's son, Khiansitha, who ruled from 1084 to 1113, continued his father's work. Khiansitha is remembered as a great builder and patron of Buddhism. He completed the Shwezigon Pagoda and constructed the magnificent Ananda Temple, one of the masterpieces of Burmese architecture. The Ananda is a perfect cube in plan, with 4 porches projecting from the centre of each side, creating a cross shape. Inside, 4 standing Buddha images, each over 9 meters tall, face the cardinal directions. The Ananda Temple represents the pinnacle of early pagan architecture. Its Sikara-style tower rises nearly 50 meters, creating a mountain of brick and stucco that dominates the plain. The interior is dimly lit, with light filtering through small windows, creating an atmosphere of mystery and reverence. The walls are covered with glazed terracotta plaques, depicting scenes from the Jataka tales, the stories of the Buddha's previous lives. Over 1,500 of these plaques survive, providing a visual narrative of Buddhist cosmology and moral teaching. Khiansitha also maintained diplomatic relations with neighbouring powers. He received missions from the Chola dynasty of South India and the Srivijaya Empire of Sumatra. He sent his own embassies to China, presenting tribute to the Song emperors and receiving in return recognition of his status as a righteous Buddhist monarch. These diplomatic contacts facilitated trade and cultural exchange, bringing Indian and Sri Lankan influences to Pagan. The 12th century was the golden age of Pagan. King after king sponsored temple construction on a scale unparalleled in Southeast Asian history. By some estimates, over 10,000 Buddhist structures were built in the pagan area during the empire's duration, ranging from massive temples to small shrines. Each king sought to demonstrate his piety and accumulate merit through building, creating a landscape utterly dominated by religious monuments. These weren't just royal projects. The wealthy elite, merchants, and even ordinary people with modest means sponsored temple construction. Inscriptions record donations of land, slaves, and resources to maintain these monuments. The temples served multiple functions. They were centers of worship, certainly, but also schools where monks taught literacy and Buddhist doctrine, rest houses for travelers, and symbols of the donor's status and merit. One of the most impressive temples from this period is the Damayangi, built in the mid-12th century, possibly by King Narathu. It is the largest temple in Pagan, with walls over 3 meters thick at the base. The massiveness of the construction has led to speculation that it was built hastily or that the king feared attack. The interior passages were filled with brick and rubble, perhaps never completed, perhaps deliberately sealed. Despite its enigmatic history, the Danmayangyi's vast bulk dominates the pagan skyline, a monument to the empire's architectural ambition. Another masterpiece is the That Bienyu temple, built around 1150. At over 60 meters in height, it was the tallest temple in Pagan and represented a new architectural development, the two-story temple with a central shrine on each level. The name That Bienyu means omniscience, one of the attributes of the Buddha. The temple's elegant proportions and soaring height exemplify the mature pagan style, where earlier experimentation had evolved into a confident architectural language. The Suleimani temple, built in 1183, represents the height of pagans' artistic achievement. Its interior walls are covered with some of the finest murals in Southeast Asia, depicting scenes from the Jataka tales and the life of the Buddha. The paintings show a sophisticated understanding of composition and narrative, with elegant figures rendered in earth tones and occasional bright blues and greens. These murals provide invaluable information about costume, architecture, and daily life in Pagan, as well as being works of art in their own right. The Pagan murals represent one of the great achievements of Burmese art, though many have been damaged or lost over the centuries. The artists who created these paintings worked with natural pigments, ochres and iron oxides for browns, reds and yellows, charcoal for black, lime for white, and precious lapis lazuli or azurite for the brilliant blues. They painted on a thin layer of plaster applied to the brick walls, working quickly before the plaster dried. The best murals show remarkable skill in depicting complex narrative scenes with multiple figures, architectural settings, and landscape elements, all organized into coherent compositions. The subject matter of the murals reflects the central place of Buddhism in pagan civilization. The Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's previous lives, were particularly popular subjects. These tales, numbering 547 in the Pali Canon, provided moral instruction through entertaining narratives. The murals show the Bodhisattva in various incarnations, as a wise hare who sacrifices himself to feed a hungry traveller, as a king who gives away his kingdom and family to demonstrate generosity, as a monkey king who saves his troop by forming a bridge with his own body. Each tale illustrated a particular perfection that the Bodhisattva cultivated on his path to enlightenment. Other murals depicted scenes from the Buddha's life, his birth from his mother's side under a sal tree, his renunciation of princely life, his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, his first sermon in the deer park at Sarnath, and his final passing into nirvana. These narrative cycles served both devotional and educational purposes, allowing illiterate worshippers to learn the fundamentals of Buddhist teaching through visual storytelling. The murals also included depictions of the Buddhist cosmos, with its multiple heavens and hells, the wheel of becoming showing the cycle of rebirth, and the various realms inhabited by gods, humans, animals, hungry ghosts, and hell beings. In addition to religious subject matter, some murals include secular scenes that provide glimpses of daily life in Pagan. We see processions of nobles and their retinues, musicians playing various instruments, dancers performing, merchants conducting business, and craftsmen at work. These scenes often appear in the lower registers of walls, below the religious narratives, perhaps representing the earthly realm in contrast to the spiritual realm depicted above. The clothing, hairstyles, and ornaments shown in these murals match those described in inscriptions and provide valuable evidence for reconstructing pagan material culture. Pagan's economy was based primarily on rice agriculture in the dry zone, supplemented by trade. The Irrawaddy River was the empire's main artery, carrying goods between the northern highlands and the southern coast. Rice, the staple crop, was grown using sophisticated irrigation systems that tapped seasonal streams and built reservoirs to store water for the dry season. The land was fertile, but rainfall was unreliable, making water management crucial to agricultural success. Trade brought wealth to Pagan. The kingdom controlled important overland routes from China through the Shan Highlands. Maritime trade conducted through Mon ports on the coast connected Pagan to the wider Indian Ocean trade network. Exports included rice, lacquerware, and timber, while imports featured Indian textiles, Chinese ceramics, and precious metals. Pagan's location allowed it to profit from the growing trade between China and the Indian Ocean world. The society of Pagan was hierarchical and based on patron-client relationships. At the top was the king, who ruled by a combination of military power, religious legitimacy, and personal charisma. Below him were the princes, ministers, and military commanders who governed provinces and led armies. The Buddhist Sangha, the community of monks, occupied a special status, exempt from taxation and corvée labour, supported by royal and private donations. The majority of the population were peasants, who worked the land and owed service to their lords. There was also a significant slave population, though slavery in Pagan was quite different from plantation slavery. Most slaves were domestic servants or agricultural workers who had been enslaved through debt, capture in war, or as punishment for crimes. They could own property and, in some cases, purchase their freedom. Buddhism permeated all aspects of life in Pagan. The concept of karma, the law of moral cause and effect, shaped behavior and social relations. Making merit through good deeds, especially supporting the Buddhist Sangha and building religious monuments, was seen as the path to a better rebirth. The king's primary duty was to promote Buddhism, both through personal piety and by sponsoring the construction and maintenance of temples and monasteries. Literacy was relatively widespread among the elite and monastic population. Education was primarily conducted in monasteries, where young boys learned to read and write, studied Buddhist texts, and absorbed moral teachings. The Pali language was used for religious texts, while Old Burmese was used for inscriptions and administrative documents. These inscriptions, carved on stone and metal, provide much of our information about pagan society, recording donations, royal decrees, and historical events. Monastic life in Pagan followed the Theravada Buddhist Vinaya, the monastic code established by the Buddha himself. Monks lived in communities called sanghas, governed by senior monks who ensured adherence to the 227 rules of conduct. A typical day began before dawn with meditation and chanting. After sunrise, monks would take their alms bowls and walk in single file through nearby villages, receiving offerings of food from lay supporters. This alms round was not begging, but rather an opportunity for lay people to make merit by supporting those who had renounced worldly life to pursue enlightenment. The monks would eat their main meal before noon, as the Vinaya forbids eating after midday. The afternoon was devoted to study and teaching. Senior monks would give Dharma talks to the community and instruct younger monks in the scriptures. Lay supporters might visit to hear teachings or receive instruction in meditation. The pagan monasteries became centers of learning, preserving not only Buddhist texts, but also knowledge of medicine, astrology, literature, and history. Monks served as teachers, counselors, and ritual specialists for their communities. They presided over life cycle ceremonies, conducted protective rituals, and advised lay people on religious and ethical matters. The monastic compounds in pagan were substantial establishments. A large monastery might include several buildings, a main hall for assembly and teaching, individual cells for monks, a library for storing palm leaf manuscripts, a bell tower, and various support buildings. The monasteries were built of wood and have not survived, unlike the brick temples, but inscriptions describe their layout and furnishings. Some monasteries housed hundreds of monks and were endowed with extensive lands, villages, and servants to support them. The most prominent monasteries became wealthy and influential, sometimes rivaling royal power. The late 12th and early 13th centuries saw pagan at its zenith. The reign of Narapatisithu from 1174 to 1211 was particularly prosperous. He built several important temples, including the Gordor Palin, and maintained the empire's territorial integrity. The city of Pagan itself was a major urban centre, with a population estimated in the hundreds of thousands, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. However, the seeds of decline were already present. The massive diversion of resources to temple building meant less investment in irrigation infrastructure and military preparedness. Religious donations were removing land and labour from the tax base, as temples and monasteries were exempt from taxation. The empire was becoming increasingly unwieldy, with outlying regions chafing under pagans' control. The reign of Hitalominlo, from 1211 to 1235, saw continued temple construction, including the magnificent Hitalominlo Temple. But there were also signs of strain. The king faced challenges to his authority from powerful provincial governors. The Shan peoples in the highlands were becoming increasingly restive. The Mon in the south retained a distinct cultural identity and may have resented Bamar domination. Then came a series of weak kings in the mid-13th century. Kyaswa, who ruled from 1235 to 1250, attempted to reform the religious establishment, limiting the Sanga's tax exemptions and trying to recover alienated crown lands. These reforms were unpopular with the powerful monastic community and may have undermined royal legitimacy. His successor Uzana faced similar challenges, and the kingdom's administrative coherence began to fray. The final blow came from an unexpected direction: the Mongol Empire. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols under Kublai Khan had conquered China, establishing the Yuan dynasty. They turned their attention southward to the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. In 1277, Mongol envoys arrived at Pagan, demanding tribute and submission. King Narathihapate, who had ruled since 1254, unwisely executed the envoys. This act brought the full weight of Mongol military power against Pagan. In 1283, a Mongol army invaded northern Burma. At the Battle of Ungasangian, the Pagan army, despite being larger, was decisively defeated. The Mongols' superior tactics discipline, and weapons, particularly their mounted archers and crossbowmen, overwhelmed the Burmese forces. Narathihapat fled south, earning the derisive nickname the King who ran away from the Chinese. The Mongols didn't occupy Pagan directly, but installed a puppet regime. The real damage, however, came from the political fragmentation that followed. The defeat shattered the prestige of the monarchy. Provincial governors declared independence. The Shan peoples descended from the highlands, establishing their own kingdoms. The Mons in the south broke away. By the end of the 13th century, the unified kingdom of Pagan had dissolved into competing regional powers. Narathihapat was eventually assassinated in 1287 by his own son. The last king to rule from Pagan Kyaoswa reigned until 1300, but controlled only a small territory around the capital. He submitted to Mongol overlordship and paid tribute, but this couldn't restore Pagan's former glory. By the early 14th century, Pagan had been eclipsed by new centres of power. The city of Pagan itself gradually declined. Without a central government to maintain them, irrigation systems fell into disrepair. Agricultural productivity declined. The population dispersed to other regions. Temple construction ceased, and existing temples began to decay. The massive monuments remained, too substantial to collapse completely, but the living city that had supported them faded away. Yet Pagan's legacy endured. The subsequent kingdoms that arose in Burma, particularly the Ava and Pegu dynasties, saw themselves as successors to Pagan. They adopted its political forms, its Buddhist orientation, and its artistic traditions. The Burmese language that developed in Pagan became the basis for modern Burmese. The architectural styles pioneered in Pagan-influenced temple construction throughout mainland Southeast Asia. Most importantly, Pagan established Theravada Buddhism as the dominant religion in Burma, a status it retains to this day. The Sangha that flourished under Pagan's patronage preserved and transmitted Buddhist teachings through centuries of political fragmentation. The Tripitaka that Anarata brought from Thaton became the foundation of Burmese Buddhist scholarship. The ideal of the Buddhist king, ruling with righteousness and supporting the religion, continued to shape Burmese political culture. The thousands of temples that still stand on the Pagan plain are a testament to the empire's devotion and artistic achievement. They range from massive multi-story monuments to small wayside shrines, but each represents an act of faith, a donation made in the hope of accumulating merit and ensuring a better rebirth. Walking among these ruins today, one can still sense the grandeur of Pagan's vision, a landscape transformed into a vast offering to the Buddha, where every vista includes multiple temples, their spires rising toward the sky. The Pagan Empire lasted approximately 400 years, from the consolidation under Anarata in the mid-11th century to the fragmentation in the late 13th century. During that time, it created one of the world's great architectural landscapes, established Theravada Buddhism as Burma's defining cultural force, and unified diverse peoples under a single political and religious framework. Though the empire fell, its cultural legacy shaped Burma for centuries to come and continues to influence Myanmar to this day. Part 3. The Dai Viet Empire. While the Khmer and Pagan empires flourished in the 10th through 13th centuries, a third great power was emerging to the east, in the Red River Delta of what is now northern Vietnam. This was Dai Viet, a Vietnamese kingdom that would fight for independence from Chinese domination, establish its own imperial identity, and expand southward over the course of several centuries, laying the foundation for modern Vietnam. The story of Dai Viet cannot be understood without first examining the long period of Chinese rule over northern Vietnam. The region had been incorporated into the Chinese Empire as early as 111 before the Common Era, when the Han Dynasty conquered the area. For over 1,000 years, northern Vietnam was ruled as a Chinese province known as Jiao Qi or Annam, meaning the pacified south. During this millennium of Chinese rule, Vietnamese society absorbed enormous Chinese influence. The Chinese administrative system, with its bureaucracy of scholar officials selected through examinations, was introduced. Confucianism, with its emphasis on hierarchy, filial piety, and moral cultivation, became the dominant philosophy of the Vietnamese elite. Chinese characters were adapted to write the Vietnamese language. Buddhism, arriving via China, took root among the population. In many ways, Vietnamese culture became a southern variant of Chinese civilization. Yet the Vietnamese never fully assimilated into Chinese culture. They retained their distinct language, despite using Chinese characters to write it. They maintained their own social customs, particularly regarding the status of women, who enjoyed greater freedom and property rights than in classical Chinese society. And they repeatedly rebelled against Chinese rule, producing legendary resistance heroes like the Trung Sisters, who led a rebellion in 40 of the Common Era, briefly establishing an independent kingdom before being defeated. The opportunity for independence came with the collapse of the Tang dynasty in China in the early 10th century. The Tang had been the strongest Chinese dynasty, and its decline created a power vacuum throughout East Asia. In 938, a Vietnamese leader named No Quyen defeated a Chinese army at the Battle of Bac Dang River using a clever strategy of planting iron-tipped stakes in the riverbed that impaled the Chinese ships when they retreated at low tide. Ngo Quyen's victory marked the end of Chinese political control over Vietnam. He established himself as king, founding the No dynasty, though his reign was brief, lasting only 6 years until his death in 944. After his death, Vietnam descended into a period of political fragmentation known as the 12 Warlords, when regional strongmen competed for supremacy. This period of chaos lasted until 968. The man who reunified Vietnam and established lasting independence was Dinh Bo Linh, a general who rose from humble origins to become king. In 968, after defeating his rivals, he proclaimed himself emperor, taking the title Dinh Tien Huang. He named his kingdom Dai Co Viet, later shortened to Dai Viet, meaning Great Viet. This was the first time a Vietnamese ruler had claimed the title of emperor, asserting equality with the Chinese emperor rather than subordinate status. Dinh Bo Linh faced immediate challenges. China was reunified under the Song dynasty, which had ambitions to reclaim Vietnam. To forestall Chinese invasion, Dinh sent tribute missions to the Song court, accepting nominal vassal status while maintaining actual independence. This became the pattern for Vietnamese relations with China, acknowledging Chinese cultural superiority and participating in the tributary system while fiercely defending political autonomy. It was a delicate diplomatic dance that Vietnamese rulers would perform for centuries. Dinh Bo Linh established his capital at Hoa Lu in a region of dramatic karst limestone mountains that provided natural defences. He organised a Chinese-style bureaucracy and created a standing army. He promoted Buddhism while also supporting Confucianism among the scholar official class. His reign was brief, lasting only 12 years before he and his eldest son were assassinated in 979 in a palace intrigue. His younger son, a child, briefly succeeded him, but the kingdom faced crisis. The throne passed to a general named Le Hone, who founded the early Le Dynasty. Le Hone, known as Le Dai Han, ruled from 980 to 1005. His reign was dominated by the threat from China. In 981, the Song dynasty launched a massive invasion, seeking to reconquer Vietnam. Le Hone met the invasion with a strategy that would become characteristic of Vietnamese resistance: avoid pitched battles, harass supply lines, and wait for disease and exhaustion to weaken the enemy. The Chinese army, despite its size and equipment advantages, found itself bogged down in unfamiliar terrain, suffering from tropical diseases and constantly harassed by Vietnamese forces. When Le Hone finally engaged the demoralized Chinese in battle, he won a decisive victory. The Song withdrew and never again attempted to conquer Vietnam by force, though they continued to exert diplomatic and cultural influence. Le Hoan also expanded Vietnamese territory southward at the expense of the Champa kingdom. The Cham controlled the central coast of what is now Vietnam, with a culture influenced by Indian rather than Chinese civilization. They were skilled sailors and sometimes raided Vietnamese and Khmer territories. Le Hoan launched punitive campaigns against Champa, briefly even capturing their capital of Indrapura in 982, though he didn't attempt to permanently occupy Cham territories. The early Le dynasty continued until 1009, when it was overthrown by a palace coup. The succeeding Lai dynasty, which ruled from 1009 to 1225, would be one of the greatest in Vietnamese history. The founder, Lai Khong Uan, known as Li Tai Tu, was a Buddhist monk who had been adopted by the previous king. He took the throne with the support of Buddhist clergy and established a government that balanced Buddhism, Confucianism, and indigenous Vietnamese traditions. Li Tai To's first major decision was to move the capital from Hoa Lu to a location at the confluence of the Red and Duong rivers, which he named Thang Long, meaning ascending dragon. This location, known today as Hanoi, was more centrally positioned to control the Red River Delta, the heartland of Vietnamese civilization. The move symbolized the dynasty's ambition to create a lasting state rather than a frontier fortress. The Lai dynasty kings were devout Buddhists who sponsored temple construction and supported the Sangha. The most famous monument from this period is the one-pillar pagoda in Thang Long, built by Li Tai Tong in 1049. According to legend, the king dreamed of the bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara sitting on a lotus flower and handing him a son. When his concubine later bore him a son, he built the pagoda in thanksgiving. The elegant structure rises from a single stone pillar in the middle of a lotus pond, representing the lotus of enlightenment emerging from the sea of suffering. The Lai dynasty established a sophisticated administrative system modelled on Chinese lines but adapted to Vietnamese conditions. The kingdom was divided into provinces and districts, each governed by appointed officials. A civil service examination system was introduced, though it was less rigorous and meritocratic than the Chinese system. Military service was organised through a system of hereditary military families who owed service to the crown in exchange for land grants. Lai Than Tong, who ruled from 1027 to 1054, strengthened the state apparatus and expanded Vietnamese territory. He launched campaigns against Champa, capturing their capital in 1044 and forcing them to cede 3 provinces. These were the first permanent Vietnamese annexations of Cham territory, beginning a centuries-long process of southward expansion known as Nam Tien, or the Southern Advance. The Lai dynasty also fought wars with the Khmer Empire. In the mid-11th century, border disputes led to conflict, with both kingdoms raiding each other's territories. In 1075, the Khmer, under King Jayavarman III, launched a major invasion of Dai Viet. The Vietnamese, led by the talented general Ly Thuong Kiet, not only repelled the invasion, but counterattacked, briefly occupying parts of the Khmer Empire. Though territorial changes were limited, the conflict demonstrated that Dai Viet was a significant power in mainland Southeast Asia. Ly Thuong Kiet himself deserves special mention. A court eunuch who rose to become the supreme military commander, he is celebrated in Vietnamese history for his defensive campaign against a Chinese invasion in 1075 to 1077. When the Song dynasty sent an army south to punish Dai Viet for raiding Chinese border territories, Ly Thuong Kiet employed scorched earth tactics, evacuating the population and destroying resources before the Chinese advance. The Song army, finding nothing to requisition, suffered from supply shortages and disease. Ly Thuong Kiet then harassed them relentlessly until they withdrew. During this campaign, a poem attributed to Ly Thuong Kiet expressed what would become a core Vietnamese identity. The southern and northern emperors each rule their own domain, as determined by destiny and the will of heaven. This assertion of separate but equal status with China, grounded in the concept of heaven's mandate, would resonate through Vietnamese history. It acknowledged Chinese cultural influence while rejecting Chinese political domination. The late Lai dynasty saw the construction of numerous Buddhist temples and the development of a distinctly Vietnamese form of Buddhism. Unlike the highly philosophical Chinese Chan Buddhism or the esoteric Vajrayana Buddhism of Tibet, Vietnamese Buddhism was syncretic, incorporating Confucian ethics, Taoist practices, and indigenous spirit worship. It emphasized practical morality and community rituals rather than individual enlightenment or doctrinal purity. The Lai dynasty ended in 1225, when the last Lai emperor abdicated in favor of his son-in-law, who founded the Tran dynasty. This transition was relatively smooth, suggesting that the Vietnamese political system had achieved a certain stability. The Tran dynasty would rule from 1225 to 1400, overseeing a period of both great achievement and existential crisis. The early Tran emperors continued the policies of their predecessors, promoting Buddhism, maintaining the Confucian bureaucracy, and defending Vietnamese independence. They also continued the Nam Tien, the the gradual expansion southward at Champa's expense. The Cham territories, with their ports and maritime trade, were attractive targets. Vietnamese settlement slowly pushed south along the coastal plain, absorbing or displacing Cham populations. The defining crisis of the Tran dynasty came from the Mongol Empire. The Mongols, having conquered China and established the Yuan dynasty, demanded that Dai Viet submit to their overlordship. When the Vietnamese refused, the Mongols launched 3 massive invasions in 1258, 1284 to 1285, and 1287 to 1288. These were truly existential threats. The Mongol armies had conquered from Korea to Hungary, and their military prowess was unmatched. They fielded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, equipped with advanced weapons and led by experienced commanders. The first invasion in 1258 saw the Mongols occupy Thang Long, though they withdrew after a short occupation, possibly due to unfavourable climate and disease. The second invasion in 1284 was more serious. A massive Mongol-Chinese army invaded by land while another force attacked by sea. The Vietnamese, led by the brilliant general Tran Hung Dao, adopted a strategy of avoiding pitched battles, evacuating cities before the Mongol advance, and harassing supply lines. The Mongols occupied Thang Long again, but they couldn't bring the Vietnamese to a decisive battle or establish control over the countryside. Tran Hung Dao understood that the Mongols' strength was in open battle, where their cavalry and discipline could devastate enemy formations. He kept his forces dispersed in the forests and mountains, launching ambushes and raids, but never offering a set-piece battle. He also prepared elaborate defensive positions and stockpiled supplies in areas beyond Mongol reach. When the Mongols withdrew in 1285, harassed by Vietnamese attacks and weakened by disease, Tran Hung Dao pursued and inflicted heavy casualties. The third invasion in 1287 was the largest and most dangerous. Kublai Khan, frustrated by the previous failures, assembled an enormous force of perhaps 300,000 men. They invaded by both land and sea, again capturing Thang Long. But Tran Hung Dao had refined his defensive strategy. He built a network of fortifications in the Red River Delta, stockpiled weapons and supplies, and prepared the population for a long guerrilla war. The decisive moment came in 1288 at the Battle of Bach Dang River, the same site where No Quian had defeated the Chinese 3.5 centuries earlier. Tran Hung Dao prepared the riverbed with iron-tipped stakes hidden beneath the water at high tide. He then lured the Mongol fleet upriver with a feigned retreat. When the tide turned, the Mongol ships were impaled on the stakes, and Vietnamese fire ships completed their destruction. It was a devastating defeat. The Mongols withdrew and never invaded again. These victories over the Mongols became central to Vietnamese national identity. They demonstrated that superior numbers and technology could be overcome by determination, clever tactics, and knowledge of the terrain. Tran Hung Dao became one of Vietnam's greatest national heroes, revered to this day. His strategic writings, emphasizing mobility, deception, and the moral foundation of military success, influenced Vietnamese military thinking for centuries. The late Tran dynasty saw continued prosperity and cultural development. Literature flourished, with works written in both classical Chinese and Nom, a script that adapted Chinese characters to write Vietnamese. Buddhism reached new heights of sophistication, with Vietnamese monks engaging with Chinese, Korean, and Tibetan traditions. The economy grew as rice production expanded in the Red River Delta and trade increased with China and maritime Southeast Asia. Vietnamese literature in the Tran period achieved remarkable sophistication. Scholars composed poetry in classical Chinese, following the strict tonal and rhythmic rules of Chinese verse while expressing distinctly Vietnamese concerns and sensibilities. The greatest Tran-era poet was Nguyen Trai, the brilliant strategist who advised Le Loi during the resistance against the Ming. His poetry combined Confucian learning, Buddhist insight, and passionate patriotism. His most famous work, The Proclamation on the Pacification of the Wu, justified Vietnamese independence using Chinese political philosophy, arguing that Vietnam and China were separate realms, each governed by the mandate of heaven. The development of Nom script allowed Vietnamese writers to express themselves in their native language while still using Chinese characters. Nom worked by either using Chinese characters for their meaning or their sound, or combining characters to create new compound characters representing Vietnamese words. The system was complex and required knowledge of both Chinese characters and Vietnamese phonetics, limiting literacy to the educated elite. Nevertheless, Nom literature flourished, particularly poetry that captured the rhythms and tones of spoken Vietnamese. These poems dealt with themes of love, loss, nature, and the transience of life, often with a melancholy beauty characteristic of Vietnamese literary sensibility. Historical writing was another important genre in Dai Viet. Confucian scholars saw the recording of history as a crucial duty, providing moral lessons from the past and legitimizing current political arrangements. The Dai Viet court maintained official histories modelled on Chinese dynastic histories, recording the reigns of kings, major events, natural disasters, and other noteworthy occurrences. These histories, written in classical Chinese, followed strict conventions of structure and style. They emphasized the moral character of rulers, the importance of righteous governance, and the workings of heaven's mandate in human affairs. Buddhist scholarship in Dai Viet drew on multiple traditions. Vietnamese monks traveled to China to study at famous monasteries, bringing back texts and teachings. Some went to India or Sri Lanka, though this was rarer due to the distance and difficulty of travel. Vietnamese Buddhism developed its own schools and lineages, particularly the Thein school, equivalent to Chinese Chan or Japanese Zen. Thein emphasized meditation and direct insight rather than textual study, though Vietnamese Thein monks were also learned scholars. Many Tran emperors practiced Thein Buddhism, and some abdicated to become monks, a practice that scandalized Confucian officials but demonstrated the depth of Buddhist influence on Vietnamese culture. However, the 14th century also brought challenges. The Tran emperors became increasingly focused on religious pursuits, sometimes abdicating to become monks while retaining real power. This created confusion in the succession and weakened the monarchy's prestige. Court factions competed for influence, and the bureaucracy became increasingly corrupt. Regional governors gained autonomy, paying nominal allegiance to the court while building their own power bases. The final crisis came from an ambitious general named Ho Ki Li. Starting as a provincial official, he married into the Tran royal family and maneuvered his way into positions of power. By 1398, he controlled the government, and in 1400 he forced the last Tran emperor to abdicate in his favour, establishing the Ho dynasty. This usurpation was unpopular and provided an opportunity for Chinese intervention. The Ming dynasty, which had replaced the Yuan in China, used the pretext of restoring the Tran dynasty to launch an invasion in 1406. The Ho dynasty, despite Ho Quy-lai's administrative reforms and military preparations, couldn't withstand the Ming onslaught. By 1407, the Ming had conquered Dai Viet, capturing both Ho Quy-lai and his son. For the first time in 4 centuries, Vietnam was under direct Chinese rule. The Ming occupation, lasting from 1407 to 1428, was harsh. The Chinese attempted to eradicate Vietnamese culture, destroying historical records, seizing artworks and books, and imposing Chinese institutions. They suppressed Vietnamese customs and tried to force assimilation. This cultural genocide provoked fierce resistance among the Vietnamese population. Resistance began almost immediately, but was brutally suppressed. Various leaders rose up, only to be defeated and executed. Then, in 1418, a wealthy landowner named Le Loi began organizing a resistance movement in the mountainous Thanh Hoa province. Le Loi's rebellion differed from earlier uprisings in its careful organization and long-term strategy. He spent years building support, avoiding major battles, and establishing a base area before launching major operations. Le Loi was aided by a brilliant strategist named Nguyen Tre, a scholar official who became his chief advisor. Nguyen Tre not only planned military campaigns, but also crafted a compelling ideological framework for the resistance, emphasizing Vietnamese distinct identity and the mandate of heaven's transfer from the Ming to a new Vietnamese dynasty. His writings combined Confucian political theory with Vietnamese nationalism. The resistance war lasted 10 years, from 1418 to 1428. Le Loi employed guerrilla tactics, avoiding pitched battles and focusing on ambushes and raids. He slowly wore down the Ming forces, which were far from their bases and vulnerable to tropical diseases. He also appealed to the population's patriotism and resentment of Chinese rule, building popular support. In 1427, Le Loi felt strong enough to lay siege to the Ming garrison in Thang Long. The siege lasted several months, during which a Ming relief army marched south. Le Loi met and defeated this army in a series of battles, demonstrating that his forces had evolved from a guerrilla band into a disciplined army capable of conventional warfare. With their main army defeated, the Ming garrison in Thang Long negotiated surrender. Le Loi allowed the Ming forces to withdraw peacefully, a generous gesture that reflected Nguyen Tri's advice to avoid unnecessary bloodshed and demonstrate Vietnamese willingness to coexist peacefully with China. In 1428, Le Loi proclaimed himself emperor, founding the Le dynasty, also known as the later Le dynasty, to distinguish it from the earlier dynasty. The Le dynasty would rule, at least nominally, until 1788, making it the longest-lasting Vietnamese dynasty. Le Loi and his successors established a strong, centralized state. They created a comprehensive legal code, the Hong Duc Code, which balanced Confucian principles with Vietnamese customary law. They expanded the civil service examination system, making it the primary route to official positions. They promoted education, establishing schools throughout the kingdom. The early Le Dynasty is remembered as a golden age of Vietnamese independence and cultural flourishing. The Le Dynasty also continued the Nam Tien, the southward expansion. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, Vietnamese settlers moved south, establishing new villages in former Cham territories. The Champa kingdom, already weakened by centuries of conflict, gradually shrank until by the 17th century it was reduced to a small region in the far south. Vietnamese settlers brought their agricultural techniques, particularly wet rice cultivation, transforming the landscape. This expansion brought Vietnam into contact with new peoples and cultures. The Vietnamese encountered the Khmer, with whom they competed for control of the Mekong Delta. They met highland peoples, speaking various languages and practicing different religions. They also encountered European traders and missionaries who began arriving in the 16th century. These contacts would gradually transform Vietnamese society. However, the later Le Dynasty also experienced decline. By the 16th century, powerful noble families had gained enormous influence, sometimes overshadowing the emperors. Court factions competed viciously for power, leading to instability and occasional violence. Two families in particular, the Trinh in the north and the Nguyen in the south, became so powerful that they effectively divided the country, with the Le Emperor reduced to a figurehead. This division, lasting from the late 16th to the late 18th century, meant that Dai Viet was no longer a unified empire, but rather two rival domains acknowledging the same nominal emperor. The Trinh lords controlled the Red River Delta and the northern territories, while the Nguyen lords controlled the centre and south. They fought intermittent wars, but neither could overcome the other. During this period, both domains continued to expand. The Trinh westward into the highlands, the Nguyen southward into the Mekong Delta. The Nguyen lords' expansion into the Mekong Delta brought them into direct conflict with the Khmer Empire, which was also in decline. Vietnamese settlers moved into Khmer territories, establishing communities and bringing land under cultivation. The weak Cambodian kings could do little to stop this infiltration. By the 18th century, much of the Mekong Delta was under Vietnamese control, though Khmer populations remained, and the area retained a culturally mixed character. The 18th century also saw Vietnam's first significant contact with European culture. Portuguese, Dutch, and French traders established posts along the coast. Catholic missionaries, particularly French Jesuits, converted significant numbers of Vietnamese to Christianity. One missionary, Alexandre de Rhodes, created a Romanized script for Vietnamese called Quoc Ngu, which would eventually replace Chinese characters as the standard writing system. These European influences were still limited, but they foreshadowed the colonial era to come. In 1771, a major rebellion erupted in central Vietnam, led by three brothers known as the Tay Son. The Tay Son rebellion began as a peasant uprising against the Nguyen lords' exploitation, but quickly evolved into a movement to overthrow both the Trinh and Nguyen and restore strong central government. The Tay Son armies, drawing on popular support and military innovation, defeated both the Nguyen and Trinh forces, reunifying Vietnam for the first time in 2 centuries. The youngest Tay Son brother, Nguyen Hue, proved to be one of Vietnam's greatest military commanders. In 1788, when the Qing dynasty of China invaded Vietnam to restore the Lê Emperor, Nguyen Hue marched north with an army. In a lightning campaign during the Tet holiday, when the Chinese were unprepared, he surprised and routed the Qing forces. This victory, comparable to Tran Hung Dao's triumphs over the Mongols, secured Vietnamese independence and Nguyen Hue's position as emperor. However, the Tay Son dynasty proved short-lived. After Nguyen Hue's death in 1792, the regime faced internal divisions and external challenges. A surviving member of the Nguyen Lord family, Nguyen An, who had fled to Thailand during the Tay Son victories, returned with French support. Through a series of campaigns lasting from 1792 to 1802, Nguyen An defeated the Tay Son and reunified Vietnam under his rule. In 1802, Nguyen An proclaimed himself Emperor Gia Long, founding the Nguyen dynasty and naming his kingdom Vietnam, a name that endures to this day. He moved the capital to Hue in central Vietnam, symbolizing the kingdom's extension from the Chinese border in the north to the Cam Mau Peninsula in the south. The Nguyen dynasty would be Vietnam's last imperial dynasty, ruling until the abdication of Bao Dai in 1945. The story of Dai Viet, from its foundation in the 10th century to the establishment of a unified Vietnam in the 19th century, is one of persistent struggle for independence and gradual territorial expansion. The Vietnamese fought off repeated Chinese invasions, defeated the mighty Mongol Empire 3 times, and slowly pushed southward along the coast, absorbing or displacing the Cham and pushing into Khmer territories. Throughout these centuries, they developed a distinct national identity that combined Chinese cultural influences with indigenous traditions and a fierce commitment to political autonomy. Dai Viet's impact on Southeast Asian history was profound. As a major power in the region, it helped shape the political geography of mainland Southeast Asia. Its conflicts with Champa and Cambodia contributed to the decline of those kingdoms and the expansion of Vietnamese settlement southward. Its resistance to Chinese domination demonstrated that even a smaller state could maintain its independence against a vastly larger neighbour through military skill, strategic wisdom, and national unity. The cultural legacy of Dai Viet is equally significant. The synthesis of Confucianism, Buddhism, and indigenous Vietnamese traditions created a unique cultural formation that shaped Vietnamese society for centuries. The development of Vietnamese literature, both in classical Chinese and in the vernacular Nom script, created a rich literary tradition. The architectural monuments, from the Temple of Literature in Hanoi to the Citadel of Hue, stand as testaments to Vietnamese aesthetic sensibilities and engineering skills. Most importantly, Dai Viet established the concept of Vietnamese national identity. The experience of resisting foreign domination, the commemoration of heroes like the Trung sisters, Tran Hung Dao, and Le Loi, and the sense of possessing a distinct civilization created a powerful national consciousness. This identity would sustain the Vietnamese people through the challenges of French colonialism in the 19th and 20th centuries and continue to shape Vietnam today. Conclusion: the legacy of lost empires. The Khmer, Pagan, and Dai Viet empires, though separated by geography and differing in culture, shared common patterns that illuminate the nature of pre-modern Southeast Asian civilization. Each arose in a fertile river valley where intensive wet rice agriculture could support dense populations. Each absorbed and adapted influences from the great civilizations of India and China while developing distinct identities. Each built impressive monuments that combined religious devotion with political assertion, and each left lasting legacies that shaped the nations that succeeded them. The Khmer Empire's influence on Southeast Asian civilization cannot be overstated. Angkor's temples represented the apotheosis of classical Southeast Asian architecture, combining Indian cosmological concepts with indigenous engineering genius. The empire's water management systems demonstrated sophisticated understanding of hydrology and agriculture. The Khmer language and script influenced neighbouring Thai and Lao languages. The concept of divine kingship, while originally Indian, was developed to its fullest expression in the Khmer context, influencing monarchical ideology throughout the region. Modern Cambodia, despite centuries of turmoil following Angkor's decline, remains deeply shaped by the Khmer Empire's legacy. The temple complex of Angkor Wat appears on the national flag, symbolizing both past glory and cultural continuity. The Khmer language, evolved from the tongue of the ancient empire, is the national language. Buddhism, which Jayavarman VII elevated to state religion, remains the faith of the overwhelming majority. The memory of the empire, both its achievements and its fall, shapes Cambodian historical consciousness and national identity. The Pagan Empire's primary legacy was the establishment of Theravada Buddhism as the defining element of Burmese culture. The religious transformation that began when Anurata brought the Tripitaka from Thaton created a Buddhist civilization that has endured through political fragmentation, foreign conquest, and social upheaval. The ideal of the Buddhist king, ruling with righteousness and supporting the Sangha, shaped Burmese political culture until the modern era. Even after the empire's fall, successive Burmese kingdoms saw themselves as restoring pagans' glory. The thousands of temples on the pagan plain stand as a testament to the empire's devotion and artistic achievement. These monuments influenced temple architecture throughout mainland Southeast Asia. The Burmese language that developed in pagan became the basis for modern Burmese. The integration of diverse peoples including Bamar, Mon and Shan under a single political and religious framework created patterns that would shape Burma's complex ethnic politics for centuries. Dai Viet's most significant legacy was the creation of Vietnamese national identity. The experience of maintaining independence against Chinese domination, commemorated in the victories of No Quyen, Tran Hung Dao, and Le Loi, became central to Vietnamese self-understanding. The concept of Vietnam as a distinct civilization, culturally influenced by but politically independent of China, shaped Vietnamese history through the colonial and post-colonial eras. The southward expansion, the Nam Tien, created the geographical extent of modern Vietnam. These three empires also shared common patterns of decline. The Khmer Empire was weakened by overextension, the costs of massive building programs, environmental degradation, and the rise of rival powers. Pagan fell to a combination of internal weakness and external shock from the Mongol invasion. Dai Viet experienced cycles of strength and fragmentation, with strong dynasties followed by periods of division, though it showed remarkable resilience in repeatedly reconstituting itself. Environmental factors played a role in each empire's trajectory. The Khmer Empire's dependence on an elaborate irrigation system made it vulnerable to system failures and environmental changes. Pagan's concentration of resources in temple construction may have diverted investment from irrigation maintenance. Dai Viet's southward expansion was both enabled by and contributed to environmental transformation, as forest was cleared for rice paddies and wetlands were drained. All three empires demonstrate the fundamental importance of water management in Southeast Asian civilization. The monsoon climate, with its dramatic seasonal variation in rainfall, required sophisticated systems to store water, distribute it, and protect against flooding. The empires that mastered water management, like Angkor with its berets and Dai Viet with its Red River delta dikes, could support large populations and powerful states. When these systems failed, whether through neglect, environmental change, or political breakdown, the demographic and economic base for empire collapsed. The hydraulic systems of these empires were engineering marvels that rivaled anything achieved in the ancient world. The Khmer berets, some measuring 7 kilometers long, required moving millions of cubic meters of earth to create the embankments. The canals that distributed water from these reservoirs extended for hundreds of kilometers, following contours with precision that demonstrates sophisticated surveying and engineering knowledge. At Pagan, irrigation works tapped mountain streams and built reservoirs in the dry zone, transforming arid land into productive rice fields. In the Red River Delta, the Vietnamese built dikes hundreds of kilometers long to contain floodwaters and protect agricultural land. These were not one-time projects, but ongoing efforts that required constant maintenance and periodic reconstruction, mobilizing tens of thousands of workers year after year. The social organization required to build and maintain these hydraulic works shaped the political structures of these empires. Centralized authority was necessary to coordinate large-scale projects, mobilize corvée labor, and resolve conflicts over water allocation. This may explain why Southeast Asian states tended towards centralized monarchies with elaborate bureaucracies. The king's legitimacy derived partly from his ability to maintain the infrastructure that sustained the agricultural economy. A king who could not maintain irrigation works or protect against floods risked losing both material prosperity and the mandate of heaven. Religion served as both a unifying force and a source of change in these empires. For the Khmer, the shift from Hinduism to Buddhism under Jayavarman VII and later to Theravada Buddhism transformed the relationship between state and society. For Pagan, Theravada Buddhism provided ideological unity, but also created a powerful monastic establishment that could resist royal authority. For Dai Viet, the synthesis of Confucianism and Buddhism created a flexible system that could adapt to different circumstances while maintaining cultural coherence. The relationship with China shaped all three empires, though in different ways. The Khmer maintained distant but correct relations with Chinese dynasties, sending tribute missions and receiving recognition. Pagan had less direct contact, but was ultimately affected by the Mongol conquest of China. Dai Viet had the most complex relationship, having experienced Chinese rule directly and fought repeatedly to maintain independence, creating a national identity defined partly in opposition to Chinese domination. These empires existed in a broader Southeast Asian world system characterized by both competition and cultural exchange. Trade networks connected them to each other and to the wider Indian Ocean and South China Sea trading world. Buddhist monks and texts circulated between kingdoms. Diplomatic missions carried gifts and information. Wars, while destructive, also created opportunities for cultural transmission as captives brought skills and knowledge to their captors. The monuments these empires left behind continue to inspire wonder. Angkor Wat, with its perfect proportions and elaborate bas-reliefs, draws millions of visitors annually. The temple plain of Pagan, with thousands of Buddhist monuments scattered across the landscape, creates a vista unlike anywhere else on earth. The citadel of Hue, built by Dai Viet's successor state, exemplifies the synthesis of Chinese and Vietnamese architectural traditions. These physical remains connect us directly to these lost civilizations, allowing us to glimpse their achievements and aspirations. The study of these empires reminds us that history is not a simple narrative of progress from primitive to advanced, traditional to modern. These were sophisticated civilizations with complex bureaucracies, advanced technologies, and rich cultural productions. They developed solutions to problems of governance, agriculture, and social organization that were in many ways superior to contemporary European systems. The subsequent decline of these empires and the eventual European colonization of Southeast Asia was not inevitable or the result of inherent superiority, but the product of specific historical circumstances. Modern nationalism in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Vietnam draws heavily on the memory of these empires. Politicians invoke the glories of Angkor, Pagan, and the Vietnamese victories over China to inspire patriotism and legitimize their rule. Heritage sites are preserved and promoted as symbols of national achievement. Historical narratives emphasizing resistance to foreign domination and the unique character of national culture reflect contemporary political concerns as much as historical realities. Yet these empires also pose challenges to modern nation-states. The Khmer Empire controlled territories now claimed by Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam, creating competing historical narratives and occasional diplomatic tensions. The expansion of Dai Viet came at the expense of the Cham and Khmer, creating minority populations within modern Vietnam with complex relationships to the dominant Vietnamese narrative. The multi-ethnic character of Pagan's domain is reflected in modern Myanmar's ethnic conflicts. The archaeological and scholarly study of these empires continues to evolve. New technologies, from satellite imagery to ground-penetrating radar, reveal previously unknown structures and settlement patterns. Interdisciplinary approaches combining archaeology, epigraphy, art history, and environmental science provide more nuanced understandings of how these societies functioned. Each discovery adds to our knowledge, while often raising new questions. Perhaps most importantly, these empires remind us of human capacity for both creation and destruction. The same societies that built Angkor Wat and the Ananda Temple also waged wars, enslaved captives, and sometimes oppressed their own populations. The kings who sponsored great works of art and supported religious institutions also demanded heavy taxes and corvée labour. Understanding these empires requires holding these contradictions in mind, recognizing both achievements and costs. As we reflect on the Khmer, Pagan, and Dai Viet empires, we're reminded that all civilizations are temporary. The great cities, the powerful monarchs, the elaborate religious systems, all eventually passed away or were transformed beyond recognition. Yet the legacy endures in languages spoken, monuments standing, and cultural traditions practiced. These lost empires are not truly lost, but transformed, their influence woven into the fabric of modern Southeast Asian civilization. The story of these three empires is ultimately a human story. It's about people responding to their environment, organizing themselves into societies, creating meaning through religion and art, competing for resources and power, and leaving legacies for future generations. It's about the universal human drives to build, to believe, to belong, and to be remembered. In studying these distant civilizations, we learn not just about the past, but about the enduring patterns of human social life. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll dream of golden spires rising above jungle canopy, of vast irrigated plains stretching to distant mountains, of armies marching beneath silk banners, of monks chanting sutras in candlelit temples. The Khmer, Pagan and Dai Viet empires may be gone, but their echoes resonate through the centuries, reminding us of the grandeur and fragility of human civilization. Imagine standing at dawn in the Angkor complex, mist rising from the moat surrounding Angkor Wat as the sun's first rays touch the central towers, turning the grey sandstone golden. Or picture yourself on the Pagan plain at sunset, when the setting sun casts long shadows across thousands of temple spires and stupas, the brick structures glowing amber and red. Or envision the Red River Delta during harvest season, endless green rice fields dotted with the conical hats of farmers bending to cut the golden grain, water buffalo standing patient in the shade, all the product of 1,000 years of Vietnamese hydraulic engineering and agricultural knowledge. These empires created works that have outlasted their political power, monuments that continue to inspire awe and devotion centuries after the kingdoms that built them disappeared. Angkor Wat still draws pilgrims and tourists from around the world, and monks still chant prayers in its galleries. The temples of Pagan remain active sites of Buddhist worship, with fresh flowers and incense smoke rising before ancient Buddha images. The Temple of Literature in Hanoi, founded under the Lai Dynasty, still honors the Confucian tradition of scholarship that shaped Vietnamese culture. In these places, the past is not dead, but living, continuously reinterpreted and reimagined by each generation. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the lost empires of Southeast Asia. This has been Sleepless History, where the past comes alive to help you find rest. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the wonders of ancient civilizations. As you close your eyes tonight, let your mind wander through these ancient lands. Feel the tropical warmth, hear the rustle of palm fronds in the breeze, smell the incense burning in temple courtyards. The stories of these empires remind us that while kingdoms rise and fall, human creativity, devotion, and resilience endure. The farmers who worked the rice paddies, the artisans who carved the temples, the monks who preserved the scriptures, the soldiers who defended their homelands, all played their part in creating civilizations that shaped the world. Their work continues to speak to us across the centuries, teaching us about the possibilities and limits of human achievement. Rest now, and let the gentle rhythms of history carry you into peaceful sleep.